Beloved viewers, imagine a woman standing alone on a frozen shoreline at the edge of the Arctic world, the wind screaming like a warning from nature itself, the sky dark for months at a time. And somewhere in the silent white distance, a pair of polar bears watching her every move. 2 years later, when rescuers finally returned, what they found there was something no scientist, no soldier, and no explorer could explain. The story begins far from the Arctic, in a quiet coastal town where few people expected history to unfold. Her name was Elena Markov, a wildlife behavior researcher whose life had always been balanced between quiet intelligence and restless curiosity. People who knew her often said she carried the same stubborn determination they had once seen in explorers like Roald Amundsen, the legendary man who first conquered the South Pole. But Elena's obsession was not conquering nature. She wanted to understand it, especially the creatures most people feared. Her father had once warned her about that curiosity. When Elena was just 12, she had found an injured fox in the woods behind their home and nursed it for weeks in secret. When it finally ran back into the forest, she cried for hours. Her father, a quiet fisherman with rough hands and tired eyes, sat beside her and said something she would never forget. "Animals do not belong to us. They belong to the wild. If you love them, you must let them remain dangerous." For years, Elena tried to live by those words. But love has a strange way of bending rules. By the time she turned 32, Elena had already spent years studying predator behavior in remote parts of Alaska and northern Canada. Her work gained attention among wildlife experts who admired her strange ability to remain calm around animals that terrified most researchers. Some even joked that she had the patience of Jane Goodall and the stubborn courage of Steve Irwin. But there was another side to Elena's life that very few people knew about. She was slowly losing her eyesight. It started with small things: blurred letters while reading research notes, headaches after staring across snowy landscapes. Doctors eventually gave her a diagnosis that sounded almost unreal to someone whose career depended on observation. A degenerative condition that would eventually take most of her vision. The doctors were gentle but honest. Within 5 or 6 years, she would see very little. Friends begged her to stop traveling to remote locations. Her mother cried during phone calls, asking her to come home and take a university teaching job somewhere safe. But Elena refused. In her private journals, which were discovered years later, she wrote a sentence that still chills those who read it. "If my eyes are fading, then I will spend the time I have left looking at the most powerful creatures on Earth." That decision led her to the Arctic. Not the tourist version people imagine with cruise ships and research stations full of staff. Elena chose one of the most isolated observation zones in the high Arctic, a frozen wilderness where polar bears roam across drifting ice and temperatures fall so low that metal can crack like glass. Her mission was simple on paper: document polar bear behavior without interference. But the truth behind the expedition was darker. The research team funding her project had limited resources, and the station she would use was barely more than a reinforced cabin surrounded by ice and silence. Supply flights could only arrive a few times each year. Most of the time, she would be completely alone. When the final helicopter dropped her off, the pilot looked uneasy. The man had flown military missions before, yet even he glanced at the endless white horizon with quiet discomfort. 2 months, he told her Beffin, or leaving. Weather permitting, we'll come back in 60 days. Elena nodded with quiet confidence. Quiet confidence. She had survived worse conditions before, but nature had already begun preparing a different story. The first few weeks were peaceful. Her audio logs from those days sound calm, almost cheerful. She described the rhythm of Arctic life, the strange beauty of endless snow, the distant shapes of polar bears wandering across frozen water like ghosts. At first, she observed them from a safe distance using long-range cameras and scopes. Then something unusual began happening. One of the bears started appearing near the cabin more often than expected. Not attacking, not threatening, just watching. In one recording, Elena's voice drops to a whisper as she describes the moment. "There's a female out there, maybe 200 meters away. She's been sitting on the ice for almost an hour. She's not hunting, she's not moving, she's just looking. For most Arctic researchers, that would have been a warning sign. Polar bears are not like wolves or foxes. They are apex predators designed by evolution to hunt creatures nearly their own size. Humans are not something they fear. But Elena didn't feel fear. She felt curiosity. Days later, the female bear returned, this time with a cub. That was when everything began to change. In her next audio entry, her voice sounds strangely emotional. She brought the cub closer today. I don't know why. They stayed near the ridge for almost 20 minutes. The cub kept standing up, trying to look at the cabin windows. But the moment that truly shocked researchers came from a final entry recorded weeks later. A storm was approaching, and Elena sounded weak, her voice shaking slightly in the freezing wind. I think they know I'm here. Not like prey, something else. The cub tried to come closer today, but the mother stopped it. She keeps watching me the way people watch strangers. Then she paused for a long moment and quietly added words that investigators would replay again and again years later. If something happens to me, I hope they remember me. What Elena did not know at that moment was that the supply helicopter scheduled to return in 60 days would never arrive. A violent Arctic storm system would swallow the region for weeks, destroying communication signals and making flights impossible. And as the world moved on, believing Elena Markov was safely continuing her research. She was slowly becoming one of the most mysterious lost figures the Arctic had ever seen. Alone, with polar bears, and a secret no one would discover for 2 years. Type, continue to continue the story. Continue, respected souls who have ever stared into the face of loneliness. Imagine what it feels like when the world slowly forgets that you are alive. No rescue helicopter on the horizon. No radio signal returning your call, just the endless Arctic wind and the quiet breathing of creatures that could end your life in seconds. For Elena Markov, the moment she realized something had gone wrong did not come with panic. It came with a silence so deep, it felt almost sacred. The 60 days passed quietly at first. Elena marked them carefully in her journal, scratching small lines beside each date like a prisoner counting time on a cell wall. The helicopter was supposed to appear over the white horizon on the morning of the 61st day. She woke early, brewed weak coffee over the small fuel stove, and stepped outside into the gray light. The Arctic sky was empty. At first she assumed weather had delayed the flight. That happened often in the snow winds. She told herself they would come tomorrow. Tomorrow became 3 days. 3 days became 10. The radio remained silent except for static that hissed like whispers from another world. Elena tried every frequency she knew. She called the research base. She called the aviation company that operated the flights. She even tried emergency channels used by military aircraft. Nothing answered. Nothing answered. In one of her recordings from that week, her voice still carried determination. They must be waiting for the storm season to pass, she said calmly. It's inconvenient, but manageable. But the truth began creeping in like the cold. Supplies were not endless. The cabin had enough dried food for perhaps 4 months if rationed carefully. Fuel for heating was another concern. Arctic nights were not simply cold, they were lethal. Temperatures could fall so far below freezing that exposed skin could burn within minutes. Yet Elena did not panic. Instead, she did something few stranded people would consider. She began talking to the bears. At first, it happened by accident. One evening, she stepped outside to check the ice shelf near the cabin and saw the same female polar bear again. The cub followed behind her, clumsy and curious, its large paws sinking into fresh snow. They were closer this time, too close. Any survival manual would advise retreating immediately, but Elena simply stood still, holding a small camera in trembling hands. "Hello," she said softly. The wind carried her voice across the frozen ground. The mother bear lifted her head. For a moment, the two species simply looked at each other, predator and human, separated by millions of years of instinct. Then the cub did something strange. It sat down. Elena later described the moment in her journal with shaky handwriting. It looked like a child listening. From that day forward, the bears became a strange part of her routine. They never approached aggressively. They stayed near the ridges of ice, watching the cabin from a distance. Sometimes the cub would wander closer, but the mother always nudged it back. Weeks passed. Elena's voice recording slowly changed. Loneliness began creeping into her words. She started speaking to the recorder as if it were a person. "I think the cub is getting big." "Sure," she said during one entry. "Maybe 5 months old now. Still curious. I wonder if it understands that I'm not part of their world." Another entry sounded more fragile. "I tried the radio again today. Still nothing. I suppose the storm season must be worse than expected." But the truth was far worse than she realized. Back in civilization, the research organization funding her trip had collapsed financially. Administrative chaos, miscommunication, and bureaucratic mistakes buried Elena's expedition under paperwork and forgotten schedules. The helicopter crew believed another contractor had already retrieved her. The contractor believed the original team had done it. No one noticed the error. By the time someone realized Elena Markov was missing, winter had already sealed the Arctic in darkness. Meanwhile, the woman herself was slowly becoming part of the frozen wilderness. Her eyesight continued deteriorating. The bright snow glare made the condition worse. Some days she could barely read her own notes. She began relying more on audio recordings instead of writing. In one emotional entry, she confessed something that broke the hearts of investigators years later. "I woke up this morning and realized the horizon looks softer, blurry. The doctor warned me this would happen. Funny how you forget about fear when you're busy surviving." But survival demanded new decisions. Food supplies were shrinking. Elena had some emergency fishing equipment, and a rifle meant strictly for defense against animal attacks. She had never intended to hunt with it, but desperation changes principles. One freezing afternoon, she walked toward the edge of a partially frozen inlet, hoping to catch fish beneath the ice. That was when she heard something behind her. Heavy breathing, a deep sound like slow thunder. She turned. The mother polar bear stood barely 20 meters away. Up close, the Nemo looked enormous, taller than any creature Elena had ever seen outside documentaries. The cub stood beside her, watching quietly.